This is broadcast number 665. It's September the 3rd, 1984. 1 year ago, just at this time, the Korean airline went down September the 1st. That caused a year of investigations, of accusations, a lot of accusations, and a lot of reports and articles toning down of the United States to the point where a year later we stated the Soviet Union probably thought it was a spy plane, that they didn't intentionally shoot down a civilian plane but had reason to think it was a spy plane. I talked to Larry Flynt yesterday on the telephone in Los Angeles. He was the first person who questioned the United States on that. He paid $23,000 for a full-page ad in the Los Angeles Times. He compared this to the Gulf of Tonkin, a clear-cut provocation, and asked people to tone down their feelings about the situation until all the truths could be told. That's the point at which I contacted him, because I felt that Larry McDonald had worked with his Mr. Franklin, who had killed a lot of Jews and blacks, and he also was involved in the shooting of Larry Flynt, which he later admitted this year in this past interim that he was involved in the paralyzing of Larry Flynt. And I wanted to do a story on Larry McDonald from Georgia, the representative from Georgia, and his links not only to the Korean airline when he was killed, but to the lawsuit taking place with the Los Angeles Police Department. And that's how I happened to write the article for Hustler, and Larry Flynt put his name on it, on the Korean airline. Last year, 5 days after the plane went down, I said there were three alternatives. Either the Soviet Union knew it was commercial, didn't care, or they thought it was a spy plane and gave ample warning, or it was a planned provocation by U.S. intelligence. And I believe that the latter was the most, there was more reason to believe the latter, and I gave 9 reasons why the planned provocation, if it was that, and one of them, of course, was breaking up the possible détente taking place between our allies and buying gas from the Soviet Union, oil and gas from the Soviet Union. Recently, there were some new articles, one in Nation magazine. I'll give the address on the reprint that comes with this tape, where to order them. A marvelous story on the Korean airline by David Pearson. He's getting a doctor's degree from Yale, and it's about the U.S., what they knew and what we knew. It's a very technical article. It doesn't go into the politics of Larry McDonald. It goes into how the plane went down and how it was a provocation and how it did break up détente and peace conversations that would take place going back to the Gary Powers incident. For what it has to offer, it's a very good, clear-cut story, and there are reprints of that, or you can go to the library and copy it or read it. Also, the Los Angeles Times this past week has a long item. The Soviets take a harsher line on the Korean jetliner and accuse Reagan of sending 269 passengers and the crew to their death. Also, a story in the Los Angeles Herald that says the United States says the Soviets still pay for the high price of the drowning, that worldwide criticism strengthened Ronald Reagan. And, of course, that's what he needed. And a gentleman who works in our State Department, I've mentioned it before, says that he believes that the United States had a provocation, that the CIA or some element of the United States government had it blown up so that it wouldn't reveal the spy secrets. And we've talked about that before. So I was giving the reasons why, and also the diversionaries. At that time, I went into detail on 9 diversionaries that were in the news, and each of them 1 year later is still unsolved, still connected to the people involved with the Korean airline provocation, and these things will go on for many years. One item I brought up was the suit by the American Civil Liberties Union against the Los Angeles Police Department. That case was solved. It was thrown out. The LAPD settled for almost $2 million and didn't want to go to trial when it was linked to Larry McDonald and the Defense Department, John Singlab, Admiral Moore, and so forth. I listed those various people from Western Goals. Licio Gelli's interconnecting links have been hidden. He left the Swiss prison, never has been seen. The Barbie case hasn't gone to trial. Mark Rich was served the wrong papers in Switzerland, hasn't been sent back to the United States for trial. His papers arrived subpoena in English instead of French or German over there. John DeLorean got off of one case easily because various reasons that we've gone into and some more I'll mention, but not his banking connections that are still the big story. The Banco Ambrosiano case settled for several $100 million, so that the links of the Vatican to these interconnecting, gun-running, dope narcotics, mafia, Odessa connections wouldn't become more in focus. They're still blurry. Henry Arsan, I mentioned that investigation of Milan, and Steve Baum and his organization of drugs, weapons, the Vatican, and the links to Mr. Ajah, the fellow who took the shot at John Paul II. Arsan died this past year in jail. I haven't even had a chance to bring that up. I have a lot of material to share with you on that. In the interim, he's dead. Henry Jackson died the same day as Larry McDonald. Henry Kissinger's buddy, Alexander Haig, is on the board of Boeing, taking over for Jackson. I'll do more on Haig. The Nugan Bank is still in the air, the murder, the mafia, the missing money, the admirals in general. So that all these 9 areas that I talk about very often and show the interconnecting links of them to each other are still dangling, unanswered. And the bottom line, of course, of all this is known as the Odessa, the network of Nazis after the Fourth Reich, where they are, how they're using their money, and how they're ready to resurface. And once Reagan has what he calls his Christian country, you'll see more quickly how these areas have used their money and are using it for this election to get their president elected, and then they can take over. Ronald Reagan, of course, is just the front for them, but that's what will happen. And then I asked the question 5 days after the accident, how would a provocation take place? And I listed 11 ways, and if you're interested, look up the sheet, compare it to the news now, and see how close and on target I was. I was up in Canada. I remember Vancouver the day that Larry McDonald went down, and took the Greyhound bus, never taken it, but I refused to give them $450 to fly from Monterey up to Vancouver and back. So I was on the Greyhound coming back September the 2nd, and within 3 days I had figured out pretty well my information stands firm, and a year later, with the best kinds of people investigating it, it's very solid, and I had put together this amount of information within 3 days, and a day and a half was riding that bus. If many of you have that large calendar, that 1948 calendar that came out the first of the year, September the 3rd, that's just an anniversary of this same time, 13 years ago, G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt had directed the anti-Castro Cubans to going into Dr. Lewis Fielding's offices on Bedford Drive in Beverly Hills. They wanted to get the conversations of Daniel Ellsberg with a psychiatrist. Shortly after that time, Elmer Davis came to my home. He got out of Folsom Prison. He was the fellow who had already served 3 years in jail. The Beverly Hills police had charged him with burglarizing the office. He never knew the doctor. He never knew the offices, and was sitting up at Folsom. Taxpayers putting up about $10,000 a year for these kind of prisoners. He heard about my work. I helped him get out and helped him with the lawsuit of Davis versus Nixon and Ehrlichman and Liddy and Hunt. It was a clear-cut case through over $3 million lawsuit, and of course it never went to trial. He was beat up. He was drugged. I went down with him once to Delle and went to court, and he did really well. And then 12 hours later, he showed up. He went to see attorney Leonard Weinglass, and who later had represented Emily Harris. Yeah, that was later with the SLA case, a few years later. And no more comments about Weinglass. I have my own opinions, but between his office and where Elmer was to meet me, he arrived with broken ribs and bones and smashed head, and every time he went to LA, he was given alcohol or drugs and was so spaced out. The suit just dropped, and at one point he was at the house. Here I thought he could only conduct it from there. He shouldn't commute back and forth, but I tried to get some kind of a safe place that he could stay. And I was talking to his parole officer, and he smashed my head and stomped on my head, and I almost got killed. He was so angry, the idea of his moving down there, but I didn't think he should be here. And we'd been in San Francisco 3 weeks earlier to visit Popeye Jackson of the United Prisoners Union. He was out of prison, and I felt that Popeye was in danger and that we were in danger, and I told Elmer he had to get out. Finally, he went to L.A. I didn't press charges for the assault, or I would have him back in Folsom for a long time, and I really thought he was going to kill me if the parole officer had been on the phone, and I got help right away. The police were there. But anyway, Popeye Jackson was killed 3 weeks later, and the whole thing just blew up. The case of Elmer Davis he never got any settlement, any award, and they all brag about later how they went in the offices. But the question of how you take a black man, pick him up in Beverly Hills, police, create a charge, send him to prison, and the White House planned it, and they make no efforts to apologize or to say, I'm sorry to that person who was victimized. You can see why I'm so skeptical of many of the things I read and pursue them further, because I can't take at face value a lot of these stories, and many of them I've had personal experiences with, which makes it even more horrendous. One quick item before I get on to many others I hope I have time for. Jack Anderson has a newsletter. I don't know if you know it. Again, I'll put the address on the printed sheet that goes with this tape. This current one has several items that were of interest to me. One has to do with the investigation of General Dynamics. You know, there were millions of dollars of overpayment and graft, and the investigation is currently going on. And one has to do with Mr. Takis Veliotis, Veliotis, He lives in Greece, and he got over $1 million in kickbacks from the subcontractor for the General Dynamics. But his son is hiding over there because they told him if he testified on General Dynamics, his son would be killed. I bring this up because of the death threats to my son and why I went off the air at this particular time, the telephone calls he got. General Dynamics is important always because it goes back to the John Kennedy assassination and the various agents that are used out of Lockheed or General Dynamics or Bell Helicopter for spying, and they're tied up to other scandals that come later, like Steve Bauman, the Mafia, the Nazi, the Odessa Network. These huge contractors for the major corporations siphon off millions, and the millions, I believe, then go to the spying agents in the Odessa. Max and Gally Clark were close friends of the Oswalds. Max Clark worked as chief of security for General Dynamics. Albert Jenner, the attorney for General Dynamics, was the attorney on the Warren Commission that covered up some of the major testimony that would prove a conspiracy. And Henry Crown, of course, is a large stockholder in General Dynamics, one of the big men behind it. And his son-in-law, David Schein, owns the Ambassador Hotel where Robert Kennedy was killed. David Schein and Roy Cohn were close buddies with Senator Joe McCarthy, these young punks looking for communists. And, of course, Roy Cohn, Schein's partner, is on Western Goals, who helped put the $100,000 computer to the Los Angeles Police Department. These names appear and reappear in various forms, but General Dynamics was in the news quite a bit this last year with those overcharges, and I mention it because of Mr. Veliotis and the death threats on his son. Also, in this newsletter, the question comes about who's running Middle East policy, and Jack Anderson says that his State Department isn't doing it, that the professionals are shut out, that only George Shultz from Bechtel and Henry Kissinger run it through Peter Rodman, R-O-D-M-A-N, from the State's Policy Planning Council. He's a protege of Kissinger. I go back to what happened in Fürth, Germany, and the Kissinger family. I don't believe that all of our Middle East policy is made up by a Jew. I don't believe that the Jordanian family would allow it, or the Jamals would allow it, or the Saudi family, or in Egypt, or Kuwait, or any of the Muslim countries, that a Jew would make all American Middle East policy as he had done for years. The Jewish cover is, I believe, only a cover, and his history in Fürth, Germany has much more to explain because of the behavior of the Muslim world and the oil multi-millionaires, the energy of the United States in the hands of Jew Kissinger. I just don't believe it, but I think it's a good cover. As I said, get your articles on the KAL. They're important. Now, just today, Klaus Barbie's name came up in the news in conjunction with William French Smith because a new book is coming out by Alan Ryan. Remember, he's the fellow from the Justice Department Office of Special Investigation. Ryan's the fellow that tried to cover up originally the link of Klaus Barbie to the Central Intelligence Agency. Prosecuting Nazi War Criminals in America by Harcourt, Brace, and Jovanovich. And William French Smith said to him, it'd be a bad decision to look into the investigation of the Nazis. Smith said that it wasn't important enough. Klaus Barbie and the CIA, he described Smith's attitude that if Congress or the press wanted an investigation, they could do it themselves. Well, Congress did an investigation. No, it wasn't the Congress. They did the Korea Gate, and they did the Senate Watergate. They did very bad investigations and hardly any prosecutions, a slap on the wrist. And what can the press do? I consider myself a journalist, or the press. After you investigate it, then what? The main question is, why is William French Smith making an effort to conceal, until he was threatened, the links of Nazi Klaus Barbie to the Central Intelligence Agency? I believe they're covering up the links that eventually would go to John DeLorean and General Motors and the cocaine in Hollywood and the cocaine in New York. That's what he's covering up. for his friend Ronald Reagan and William Casey and Paul Exalt. Drug prosecutions, he has to stay away from Barbie and the CIA because it links to DeLorean and to the United States Drug Enforcement Agency that has worked along with DeLorean. And this has been the Ronald Reagan, Paul Exalt, Richard Nixon, William Casey, Robert Vesco, all of them are tied together. So this new book is coming out, and in fact, Jack Anderson says that on March 27th, 1951, documents existed to show that 2 Army intelligence agents from the United States escorted Barbie to Genoa. We know that, gave him false papers under Altman, and that the charges were true that Barbie was Army intelligence operative after the war. I guess it took Mr. Ryan a little while to get these documents, but he finally got 3 inches thick called Marked Secret, and he got documents on that. Now, there's one book out by Brendan Murphy called The Butcher of Lyons, the story of infamous Nazi Klaus Barbie. I'll be doing more on this later. I haven't done much, but there are various quotations from this book that have a lot to do with what I've been trying to explain about John DeLorean recently and his connections to the cocaine. In this one book, it tells how Barbie was assigned to the SD office in Holland. That's the Gestapo intelligence office in Holland. And I have a lot of information I'm not going to use this evening, but I will be using it on the Prince Bernhard and the Holland connections of Klaus Barbie in Amsterdam and his work there. And he is in the Amsterdam branch office. His job was to make sure that the anti-Nazi tendencies stayed out of science, education, religion, sports, or entertainment. Now that's why there are so many deaths. You see various sports people or actors or writers and scientists, and you wonder, well, why did he die? Why should he die? And you investigate what they were doing. And they were questioning certain things that are happening now. And Barbie's role then and up to the time he was arrested was to watch things like sports and religion. And this book has various references to murders of people and newspaper people about to catch on to Klaus Barbie. Also, this particular book tells about Barbie's work with CIC, that was the United States Intelligence Group, and he passes it off in a very cavalier manner, this Mr. Brendan Murphy, and tells not only working for the United States government as soon as the war was over, but one of his jobs was to establish a long-range penetration of French intelligence installations in the French zone, starting by the autumn of 1947. Last week or so, I mentioned on the air from that book, Delle, Chiaie, how the Italian government in 1948, with the help of the CIA, it had just been formed in 47, really escalated the intelligence work and patterned themselves after the French cells. And I made a point of saying that Barbie worked for Americans in making up the investigation of the French resistance and getting them tried as traitors. The people who opposed the Nazis after the war went to jail. And this is one more reference of the CIC, the American Intelligence Group, going to France and using Nazis just as they did, identical in Italy and Holland and then in the United States, and to use them to stop all investigations of anti-Nazis. This is after the war, not during the war, but after the war. Incidentally, the DeLorean case you may have seen, or maybe you didn't, because it wasn't wire services, and this goes back to the Barbie story. Long story in the LA Times this week, the United States concedes their error in the DeLorean case, and it tells how the United States government failed to prosecute him very nicely. They asked him for a promissory note instead of cash on the deposit for the cocaine. If they had the cocaine, they would have had him. And also another story, DeLorean jury selected with expert help. And it tells how a woman came in from Houston, Texas, and handpicked the jury that later acquitted DeLorean on all 8 charges. And one of the people she used, one of the defense attorney, and this woman, Kathy Bennett, was a former California Highway Patrol officer, William Lair, 57 years old, of Playa del Rey. And she used him as a person important in the jury to try DeLorean. Well, goodness knows where he came from or how many stints in Vietnam, or whether these Los Angeles policemen, with many of them with links to military and to frogmen and all kind. I've done bios of some of them, some brief bios. Goodness knows who this guy was, but it was very important that somebody steered them away and used the case that he was entrapped by the government, even though they got letters from Congressman Edwards, which I mentioned several weeks ago. It was in July. Congressman Edwards wrote about entrapment in the government and how bad it is. And those letters went to every member of the jury, and then the articles came out that this is what they took an interpretation from a congressman. Don't convict Barbie. You use your judgment. It was entrapment because a congressman said this kind of behavior is not good. So the question of how they got the home addresses of each member of the jury, we don't know. But certainly this woman who came from Houston, Texas, would know. And it's very important to find out how many of those other jurors had positions similar to his. Remember when Dan White was tried, they had somebody from Bechtel, one from the military, one a post office clerk, federal government, and used a very good jury selection that assured that Dan White would get off. New York Times had a story, group would oust DeLorean as head of the Utah company. They're trying to sever him from that snowmobile machine because, again, the funds, the $7 million funds that I was told came from there, went to this Swiss account that belongs to Joseph Mengele from Barbie for the Odessa network. Now, the New York Times story is August 27th. The main issue is the $17 million out of one account, this DeLorean motor, and also the company in Utah. The interesting thing about the New York Times story, it says the creditors gave the reason why they want DeLorean severed from the Logan Manufacturing Company is that Cynthia Lee Brady, his personal secretary, was arrested on cocaine traffic charges, and she's an officer of the corporation that holds Logan. That the creditors contend that Ms. Brady's considerable responsibility in the administration of Logan and the notoriety surrounding DeLorean's recent trial on cocaine traffic, that he should be separated from the manufacturing of equipment for grooming the ski slopes. Ms. Brady was arrested with 3 other people in Clinton Township, New Jersey, when DeLorean was on trial. The group, there's 600 creditors in Britain that want a total of $100 million from DeLorean. The Utah company has been valued in bankruptcy actions of $9 million, estimated $9 to $10 million, and the chief issue is another $17 million, and I have to keep repeating those for you. One of the papers attached to the creditor's motion dated May 30th, signed by DeLorean, as president of DeLorean Motor Company, controlled by DeLorean. He's the sole shareholder of Logan Manufacturing, but the company identifies Ms. Brady as the assistant secretary, assistant treasurer of DeLorean Manufacturing, the only other officer being Christina DeLorean. Miss Brady, DeLorean's 30-year-old personal secretary of his estate at Bedminster, New Jersey, was arrested with the seizure of a little half-ounce of cocaine and 25 grams of marijuana. She was released on bail, and the British government have spoken with Miss Brady and have contacted through DeLorean's estate there. She had the cocaine and was arrested, but they want her removed from the Logan Manufacturing Company, and the clients of Great Britain and the motor company want $100 million. So the Utah company has this very important person who's worked 30 years with DeLorean, caught with cocaine, and that story will develop. The British money missing, the Swiss money, the Panamanian, and the Utah. Again, I want to keep stirring that up and remind you of it. Now, in the other book on Klaus Barbie, I'm reading 2 of them at the same time, trying to go through those, as well as the book on Delle Chiaie, The Butcher of Lyon by Tom Bauer. He has several references here that I want to bring out just apropos to the DeLorean case right now. He tells about Klaus Barbie was in Bolivia in early November, and in 1982, this is just prior to the arrest, this is November of 82, Klaus Barbie made a trip, and they thought he went over to Paraguay to visit Joseph Mengele. This is on page 17 of Bauer's book, Klaus Barbie, The Butcher of Lyon, that he went to visit early November Joseph Mengele. Then they said that he came back to Bolivia, his wife was sick, and he went back to Bolivia after he saw Mengele. And I've said before, Mr. Fritz Steinacker, Steinacker, from Germany and Austria, is the attorney for Joseph Mengele, and he flew from Germany to Zurich, Switzerland, to receive the $20 million, which would be from the DeLorean motor, $7 million from Utah, that was given to him and put in a bank in Zurich, that Barbie gave to Mengele to put in Europe. And this book says that he was at Paraguay early in November. That would be prior to the dates. The deposit dates were November 13th to 15th, the trip to Zurich, Switzerland, done by the head of Associated Press Photos. His home, this press man, is at Chatham, Massachusetts, Chatham, Massachusetts, and that he's the courier for Mengele. So Barbie took the money. Also, this book on the Butcher of Leon tells that cocaine is grown in Bolivia, and then it's processed in Colombia, just like it's grown in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, and was processed in Marseille. So if you see cocaine comes from Colombia, it didn't mean that it didn't come from Bolivia. Also, in Bauer's book on Klaus Barbie, it tells about his visiting de Lima, Peru, and moving there for a while with Fritz Schwend from the SS, a colonel in the Gestapo, part of Operation Bernhard. I've done many broadcasts on Bernhard, not enough. And in the next week or two, I'm going to detail the pretrial deposition of Klaus Barbie with Prince Bernhard. This is called Operation Bernhard, with actual Prince Bernhard, and his years in Holland, his several years with the Gestapo, who moved from Berlin to Amsterdam before Klaus Barbie went on to France with the Gestapo. So he was close to Schwend, but the links here to the CIA intelligence are very thick, and Prince Bernhard then went on. Bilderberger Group was formed by a man who was knighted by the Vatican, and Bernhard has the annual meeting of the top leaders of the world, which is the Odessa planners, and links to Klaus Barbie and Joseph Mengele and Martin Bormann, of course, in South America. Bauer talks about the CIC in 1947 when Klaus Barbie went to work for United States intelligence with a man named Robert Taylor. And then he very nicely passes it off. He says Taylor had been a typical CIC career. After fighting with the 84th Infantry Division in the Battle of the Bulge, that's that famous area where Otto Skorzeny and all of them were, and Henry Kissinger, he was drafted into the CIC because he spoke German. This is like Henry Kissinger. He never received special training at the headquarters at Fort Holabird, but he went on with a detachment, traveling at the front of the American advance across the Rhine up to the Elbe. Taylor, like many of the other CIC officers, felt he was part of an elite force. It could count Henry Kissinger and J.D. Salinger among the ranks. He throws in the Salinger, but Henry Kissinger was there with him, with Klaus Barbie. And again, this book on, there are two books on Barbie and one on Delle, Chiaie, that I'm intermingling the information of the three and the relationship of them to Klaus Barbie and the CIA and to Henry Kissinger and the Hollywood cocaine connections. In fact, in Bauer's book, he mentions on page 213 the making of cocaine down in Bolivia, and he says, until fashionable New York and Hollywood socialites discovered the use of cocaine as a stimulant in 1977, most of Bolivia's cocoa crop was used legally in Bolivia, payment for wages for peasants and workers who chewed the leaf, but essential to their normal day life. The remainder of the crop was illegally exported to Colombia, converted into laboratories, into paste and white powder, and the potential of the American demand was recognized by Mr. Suarez, who began the smuggling, of course, with RCIA, with Klaus Barbie, and so forth, and it became no less than a $400 million a year business by 1982, and then down there arrived Joachim Fiebelkorn, Fiebelkorn, with the Nazi uniforms to glorify the Third Reich, to start the Fourth Reich with Mr. Stefano Delle, Chiaie, with his links, Delle, Chiaie, with Otto Skorzeny, with Alan Dulles, with Mr. Donovan of the OSS. The American team that worked under so-called intelligence were immediately after the war setting up the Fourth Reich, and now the uniforms are arriving. Can you imagine when Reagan is reelected and this team, they can make $400 million a year in cocaine in 1982. Multiply the weapons, the narcotics, the intent, and the Odessa, and the silence of the American Attorney General with the drug dealers, with the Nazis and the uniforms, and their role with the characters in Hollywood and New York. And you have a story that will never end, that will always be opening up and is described in these various books. I'll do more on the book on Delle next week in the role of Otto Skorzeny, with the Odessa, with Alan Dulles, with Richard Helms. Our CIA was nothing but a front, as I say, for Nazis, for drugs, for the Fourth Reich. Every time I pick up a book today, I see more and more that confirms what I figured out about 15 years ago and have been studying ever since. We'll turn over the tape now, take a 1-second break for you to turn this over. You don't have to take 1 minute because it's not on the air right now, but if you put it on the air later, take your 1 minute and we'll go back to some other news and recent appointments of Ronald Reagan's. This is Mae Brussell, and it's side 2 of broadcast number 665, September the 3rd, 1984. Just one couple of quick items before I get to Ronald Reagan's appointments. This is part 3 of a subject that I should be doing continuously every week, but there's so many other stories in the news we have to update those also. There's a new movie called Flashpoint. You may not see your review in your local papers or catch on to what it is. It's supposed to be about the Kennedy assassination. I saw it in the LA Times. Flashpoint with Chris Christopherson and Treat Williams is the story of a U.S. Border Patrol team of 2 men that are looking into a Texas license plate, a Jeep with 1963 on it, and there's a rifle with a corpse, and a rifle with a telescopic lens and $800,000 in cash. And they go back to microfilm and the headlines of November 22nd, 1963, and trace the money, and it has to do with crossing the border from San Antonio into Mexico. It is about the John Kennedy assassination, and I thought I should turn you on in case you otherwise might miss it. Flashpoint. I'll try to see it, of course. I won't wait till it's on TV. Now, John Judge in Philadelphia, one of our best researchers. We penned the name real researchers, the phonies, the CIAs, the diversionaries, the people that split you up as against the real researchers. John is a real researcher, has been for years. He sent a picture from the Philadelphia Inquirer Wednesday, April the 15th, 1984, and it shows a manhole being sealed by a worker in Dallas as a security measure before next week's Republican National Convention. And it tells about precautionary methods being taken to protect Ronald Reagan. And here's this fellow sealing the manhole. Well, Penn Jones Jr. was the first person to say that a rifle could be fired from the manhole, and he was down there and took a passageway under the street and up through a car agency. And at the time of the Kennedy assassination, there was the possibility of extra bullet or bullets coming with silencers again coming out through the manhole. Well, of course, the researchers were all laughed at. We were laughed at when the picture of the Umbrella Man came out in the Abraham Zapruder film, and then the House Select Committee had hearings on how the CIA had a weapon in an umbrella, and they laughed at the researchers when we talked about the manhole in Texas, or manholes, but when Ronald Reagan went to Texas on the 20th anniversary of John Kennedy's murder, there's a picture of the manhole being sealed in Dallas. Remember, Ronald Reagan was on the Rockefeller Committee that was supposed to investigate parts of the Kennedy assassination, and this time they sealed them off. So why bother if it isn't possible? But of course it's possible, and it should have been investigated a long time ago. Just quickly, one item about Truman Capote, and I'll be bringing up other stories about him because I liked him for some reasons. I don't like novels, but I like some things about Truman Capote. There's a story, short one, in the LA Times this weekend by Armin Deutsch, D-E-U-T-S-C-H. Unlikely person to be writing a story. He's a financier and a close friend of Ronald Reagan's and the inner cabinet there, and they describe in the papers, a financier, film producer, and patron of the arts. And it seems strange that he was writing about Truman Capote, but he was telling about his friendship with Capote and how he was with him in the late 60s, and Truman Capote was covering the Manson case. I forgot that he was covering. I'll have to look up my news items. And they interviewed a prisoner who was up for parole in the Manson case, and Truman Capote told an officer of the court that he thought the man should never be paroled based upon what he had told him. And when asked to testify to the effect, Truman said he couldn't, that the conversation with the prisoner was privileged and confidential. And so he was subpoenaed with a document to say in court why the man shouldn't be paroled. And rather than do that, he let it unanswered and went back to New York. And a year later, he went to Palm Springs, and he was sentenced to 5 days in jail because he wouldn't tell. The man was dangerous, but he wouldn't tell why. So Truman Capote was taken to jail, and Mr. Armand Douche accompanied him to the door, and he said that he actually served 24 hours, but he said that Truman Capote was really very terrified by it, and that he didn't like being photographed, he didn't like the fingerprinting, and that he felt very intimidated. Naturally, he would. So he did spend the 24 hours, the jail doors closed, and he went through, and he stayed there, and he left and came back. Now, I've said many times the Manson family was set up by Mr. Davis of the LAPD, the police chief, Ed Davis, by Peter Pitches of the LA Sheriff's Department, of the CIA, the counterintelligence group. This was one of their test cases on middle-class white America, and to get the Sharon Tate family for a lot of combined reasons, as well as the people that were in the house. This was a cold-blooded act of purposeful murder done just as these Nazis had, Delle, Chiaie, and Barbie and the others had done the Bologna bombing, where 86 were murdered. This was a purposeful thing linked to the U.S. military, the CIA, to Beverly Hills attorneys, to Texas officials, and it's interesting that Truman Capote just dabbled in it and evidently got scared and had to serve his time in jail because he wouldn't talk about that. Now, several weeks ago on broadcast 660 and 662, I talked about appointments of Ronald Reagan, and I want to spend the next 25 minutes and the rest of the weeks on the appointments and scandals of Reagan, as well as other news that's taking place. I don't believe for a minute it'll affect the way the elections go, because most people are so abysmally stupid. But I do like to put these things on tape for you and date them, so I can say, well, look, we're not the dumb ones. We'll talk about these situations, and if they don't move on them, that's okay, but at least we are familiar with them and can continue to study them. In July, on broadcast 660, I talked about Miss Burford, who resigned out of, she was appointed to be in charge of toxic dumps and the ocean and the sky. Now that she had polluted the earth, she was to be on another important commission for Ronald Reagan, but she did leave the advisory committee, the National Advisory Committee of Oceans and Atmosphere. And I talked about Roy Brewer, Mr. Blacklist goes to Washington, and Helen Marie Taylor on the National Council of Humanities. And then broadcast 662, 2 weeks later, I referred to the different people on the National Council of Humanities and more in detail on Helen Marie Taylor, and went into Robert Laxalt and the credentials of these people that Reagan had put on to those appointments. So this is part 3 of the appointments of Ronald Reagan. I just briefly want to get back to Ann Burford and the appointment that she had. There were other articles in the newspaper saying that the Burford uproar still leaves 2 other key points untouched. She was appointed and resigned, and the Christian Science Monitor had a long article. Concern over the appointment and withdrawal of Ann Burford still doesn't answer the question. The entire question is the National Advisory Committee on Oceans and Atmosphere in the right hands, and it mentions other people, and the problem is that considering the committee membership qualifications in the past, they've always stressed scientific competence, and some of the other appointees to this commission announced simultaneously may also seem questionable, but they haven't been mentioned. The American Meteorological Society notes in its August letter there's not a professionally trained atmospheric scientist among any of them. And second, the most perplexing administration fiscal budget wants to eliminate the group altogether, which I said they wanted to do so Reagan could put businessmen and pollute and do what he wants. That the Reagan's budget for previous years had left out the proper money, and that there were bills in Congress to do this again, with the impression that Reagan appointed her because he wanted to abolish it. This one story from the Christian Science Monitor says that the mind-boggling maneuvers can't really be understood if you know how important this agency should be. It says this agency has been a science-based, research-oriented agency. Its services takes care of such things as weather forecasting for ships. They rest on this scientific foundation. This is why that we should lead the United States in major research endeavors such as Global Atmospheric Research Program and understand the ocean atmosphere. But the Reagan administration wants to wipe all that out, and he wants to ignore the development of ocean resources unless they belong to corporations. They shouldn't be studied on a scientific basis. This one story says its research budget would be trimmed from $244 million to $165, 32% cut, and at a time when we should be using it for climate and for the sea and not turn it into a business project. They would terminate the highly successful Sea Grant program, which brings resources of university sciences together, and they would reduce the national acid rain efforts, the study from 11 to 4%. Reagan doesn't want to study acid rain because the corporations put them in. They don't want to be told they're polluting. The clash of views, this story says, will underlie Reagan's consistent effort to eliminate this group. Congress has consistently reinstated it, and it's very important, they claim, to keep it going by replacing Mr. Knaus, who's leaving, Knauss, with the controversial and non-scientific people such as Ann Burford. The appointments also include Navy Captain John E. Bennett, William Brewster, a director of the Atlantic Salmon Federation, geologist Lee Gerard of the Colorado School of Mines, and a Gordon Snow from the Secretary for Resources in California. They list the various people that are on this committee. It says this is not a there's not a research oceanographer or an atmospheric science on the list at all. Whether or not such scientists will be appointed to any of the 5 remaining vacancies remains to be seen. In other words, Reagan had a whole team of people to appoint, just as we did with the National Endowment, the Endowment for Humanities, and no artists and nobody interested in humanities, and I went into that for 2 weeks. He doesn't have any scientists or researchers on oceanography or atmosphere on this committee. So the Fuhrer of Burford went down, but the other appointments are not there. There's a story that followed after she resigned, but is important. U.S. orders toxic pesticide dumped in the Gulf of Mexico. More than 10 tons of toxic pesticide are being dumped in the Gulf of Mexico on the order of federal officials who feel the chemical was manufactured improperly and could explode. They dumped 7,000 canisters off of Galveston. Another story that followed that, lethal insecticide to be dumped in the Gulf. The Coast Guard said only 2 hours after getting an emergency permit, they will dump 23 pounds of a dangerous insecticide that killed a dock worker aboard a ship last week. And the Environmental Protection Agency and the oceanographers get together and say you can dump the canisters. 1 canister exploded and 1 dock worker was killed and 8 were injured. So they quickly dumped this into the ocean and are using the ocean for hazardous waste along with the Environmental Protection Agency. When she was working for the group, this was July 23rd, radioactive waste won't harm environment. Ann Burford said, and the panel at that time, and Reagan is putting in these various admirals and not people who have protected the environment, no scientists. This story from the Houston Post said the government advisory panel recommends in a major report that we consider dumping radioactive waste in the oceans. And the committee said in its study that the track record of the experts in managing radioactive waste problem in the past and keeping the public informed does not instill confidence because of the management schemes, and yet they're appointing people who are not scientific experts who are saying, go ahead, it won't harm the ocean, dump it in. So while Mrs. Burford was kicked off or resigned because of the stampede of objections to her, and I said that's one appointment, we have about 20 or 30 to go, there are still 8 or 10 along with her that haven't made the news stories yet, and they should be in the news. Now, this isn't in terms of appointment of a commission, but this is a contract which is similar. The General Accounting Office is objecting to the Social Security, that important agency that the poor, disabled, and the retired depend upon. The Social Security contracts go to a company called Paradigm Corporation of Largo, Florida. I don't know if you've read about that or not. There's been many, many articles. I have about 40 on it. And the General Accounting Office doesn't want them to have that computer contract. The Social Security officials were asleep on the job. In 1981, they gave a $115 million contract, $150 for a computer to work for the Social Security system, and the computer still isn't working properly. The General Accounting Office said in the Social Security Administration's contract with Paradigm, they were to install 1,800 computer terminals. It's the second largest hardware buy in Social Security history, and it came to the attention of the agency that they fell behind in their services in issuing Social Security numbers, in maintaining the earning records, and taking care of benefit claims. $115 million contract. Now the Social Security is considering buying another $16.2 million equipment for the Paradigm and leasing it for $800,000 a month. The General Accounting Office warned the agency they should think twice. They're putting money into them, and they're not getting the right Social Security numbers, maintaining the earning records, and the benefit claims of people. They've been charged by Representative Jack Brooks, a Democrat of Texas, with a computer project which is undermined by potential fraud, deception, and misconduct. Remember how Ronald Reagan ran for governor for 8 years on computer and welfare cheaters, the Social Security and the welfare cheaters, and yet these systems take these huge contracts, the second largest awarded for this kind of work with Social Security, and they're charged with the potential of fraud, deception, and misconduct. And Paradigm Chairman Robert Wiggins refused to testify before the Brooks Committee. He said, we did a good job for the Social Security. Now, the agency that's going to get the contract again, that is goofing up something so essential to the small person who doesn't have a lot of capital or cash, they're being representative in this conflict and contract by Frank Mankiewicz. You know Mr. Frank Mankiewicz? He's on the board and the vice president of my dear friend Robert Keith Gray, close with Robert William Casey, with Paul Lexalt, with the CIA. The Gray office is the extension of the Central Intelligence Agency. So you might say that the CIA, by way of Frank Mankiewicz, what they say is Frank Mankiewicz is former chairman of National Public Radio, now in public relations. Now that's out of the Houston Post. They don't put he's with Robert Keith Gray of the Central Intelligence Agency in the Vatican. Gray's the one who got William Wilson, the envoy to the Vatican appointment, with Ronald Reagan, and Wilson interferes with Mark Rich and Paul Marcinkus. They use the credits for Frank Mankiewicz representing Paradigm Chairman Mr. Wiggins as being formerly with the National Public Radio and Public Relations. The Robert Keith Gray, he's the fellow that got Mrs. Edwin Meese the $40,000 a year, close to the future Attorney General. You can't prosecute Paradigm for doing things wrong if the Attorney General is Edwin Meese soon when Reagan's reelected, and Mr. Mankiewicz works with Robert Keith Gray and Meese, and they would not prosecute. That's why so many of these big corporations do get off, and the people that swindle and take the money and tie up the Social Security funds that people have paid into never get prosecuted because of these links, which are very identifiable at the present time, only because the appointment of Edwin Meese was held up that this came out. Otherwise, we wouldn't know it. Warren Reed, director of the General Accounting Office, said that one of the problems is that the Social Security rewrote their contract and relaxed their standards after Paradigm terminals failed in a single pass in 10 days of acceptance testing. They failed that, and they failed other tests. So Paradigm has been in the news quite a bit, representative for them to get their money for the Social Security, which affects everybody, comes through Frank Mankiewicz and Robert Keith Gray. Another important appointment has to do with the judiciary. Stanley Sporkin of the Central Intelligence Agency has been nominated for a judge. If he isn't appointed by the time the elections take place, he will be certainly a judge by the time Reagan is reelected or before. These judgeships aren't waiting. This nomination is for Stanley Sporkin, came out in the Washington Post. I don't know how many of you saw it. I don't know how many of you mind having a CIA attorney as a judge, the U.S. District Court. The Washington Post, June 29th, CIA Sporkin nominated a district court bench. Reagan nominated the CIA general counsel to be a judge on the U.S. District Court. If confirmed, Sporkin will fill a seat vacated earlier by Judge John L. Green, and his nomination, of course, would be for a lifetime appointment. Now, remember, Candy Jones tells just an innocent model how she was trained to hate blacks and Jews and Italians by the CIA. Look at the track record of the CIA with its Gestapo, Nazi connections with hiring people like Klaus Barbie. A CIA Attorney General Counsel, Stanley Sporkin, 52 years old, a lifetime appointment in the District Court bench in Washington, D.C. Now, this article from the Washington Post said that top-level White House and Justice Department screening committee recommended him for this lifetime appointment. You better believe it. Mr. Lowell Jensen and Edwin Meese and William French Smith would love a CIA attorney for a lifetime appointment. His recommendation came despite controversial tenure in the 1970s as the chief of the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Read the book, The Breaking of a President, put out by Art Kunken and Marvin Miller, page 193 to 212, and it tells the relationship of the Security Exchange Commission of Maurice Stans, William Casey, John Mitchell, and Robert Vesco. If you don't have that book, I'll put parts of that on the tape. And just this past few months, there have been the links of Robert Vesco to Prime Minister Pinling down in the Bahamas with F. Lee Bailey trying to clear up those drug connections. Sporkin's lifetime friend has been CIA Director William Casey, and he lobbied for his nomination to be judge in Washington, D.C. Casey again and his lifelong friend Robert Keith Gray. Imagine how many cases come before these judges, just as the judge in the DeLorean case, appointed by Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford, and the harsh sentences that poor Larry Flint got in front of that judge compared to how John DeLorean got off on all 8 charges. Now, the CIA and mob control would absolutely control the U.S. District Court through Gray's offices and Casey's clients and everybody who comes through there from the OSS to the CIA. The Washington Post said there was some opposition to the appointment in the Senate. Democrats and Republicans, some of them, regard Sporkin and Casey's joint CIA action since 1981. They studied them. Some people didn't like it, and surprisingly, Senator Proxmire said it's the best thing Reagan has done. Sporkin is marvelous, completely honest. That is such a contradiction. When you take an oath of office that you will lie if you're arrested in your CIA, that you will deny your contacts, that you will destroy your evidence. To be in that job and be a spy, a lawyer for the spy agency, you can't be honest. You have to protect the agency. So why did Proxmire say that? Washington Post says Sporkin was chief of the Enforcement Division of the Security Exchange Commission. He was a major figure in shaping the Security Exchange Commission. He helped create the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1947, which has nothing to do with what he would do if he were the judge in that court from the CIA. Born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that's like, 60 people from the Kennedy assassination and afterwards were involved with the network in Pennsylvania coming out of Philadelphia. Graduated from Yale Law School and nominated, as I say, by Ronald Reagan for this job. His wife writes for the newspaper USA Today, which is as far right as you can go. In 1978, he won the Rockefeller Public Service Award, the government's top award as a civil servant, and he was to be called for presentation of an award by President Jimmy Carter, but he was never called. He was busy investigating Carter's budget director, Burt Lance. So if he brings out the juice on Lance and lets the Reagan, Casey lack salt, Gray people go off, that's what he would do. CIA Director William Casey is his long friend. They both worked with the Security Exchange, and they were prodding the investigation of Burt Lance, and see how they go after various people like Geraldine Ferraro's contacts and leave the other ones off. And what goes to court are the Democrats, and maybe the Democrats deserve it for the sleazy investigations they do of these people. In the book Reagan's Ruling Class that I quote quite often, that's Pantheon Books that came out in 1982 by Ronald Brownstein and Nina Easton. They have references to Stanley Sporkin. They say the CIA General Counsel, he worked with William Casey at the SEC, I mentioned that, and he played a part with Robert Vesco in the ITT case when Casey destroyed evidence of the ITT case and his relationship with Robert Vesco. That was all covered up. He was supposed to be investigating that, but you know how they got off on those cases. It also says CIA General Counsel Stanley Sporkin defended William Casey's appointment of Max Ugel for covert actions for the CIA. Remember the dead missing brother, the families that were under question, the Japanese connections of Ugel, and his past was so sleazy, his business operations and his context, that Ugel was turned down as a CIA director in covert intelligence, but Sporkin defended him. This is the honest man who's supposed to be so great. Proxmire, who I usually like, refers to him as so honest, and as I say, it's a contradiction. Well, he defended the appointment of Ugel, who even Ugel resigned. He didn't like himself. It wasn't going to take the job. And Sporkin went along with that. In December 1981, December the 4th, 1981, Ronald Reagan changed the laws of the intelligence establishment. The CIA was not to have domestic spying. Of course, they've been thick in the United States, just as the KGB acts inside Soviet Union. The CIA is a domestic spy agency. But what Ronald Reagan did in 1981, December the 4th, was described as the most dramatic, visible change in the CIA. Reagan signed an executive order permitting the agency to conduct covert operations in the CIA for the first time in its history, a sharp departure from the previous law established in 1947. Originally, they didn't want the CIA to act in the United States. It was supposed to be an international organization. Now it's national. Now, when you take a man like Mr. Sporkin, who was an attorney in the CIA, and you put him on the bench, is that another way of conducting covert operations in the CIA? Because whatever cases come to trial, he has access to all that information, all the witnesses who testify for a person, against a first person. It's a very controversial question, and should an attorney who was an attorney for the CIA, who worked with Robert Vesco or William Casey, and involved with things like the ITT case, the Security Exchange Commission, what business does he have as a lifetime judge on the bench? And heaven help some innocent schnook that goes before the judge, and Your Honor this and Your Honor that, thinking that he has a judge there who will listen to both sides. And I think with the training of these people, it would be an absolute impossibility for a judge of the Central Intelligence Agency, who appointed by Ronald Reagan with his background, to listen to the both sides of the question. Now, one other quick appointment, which is terribly important, and I'll do more of the appointments next week. Controversial general due for a weapons post. I don't know if you saw these articles. They came out in July. This has to do with a man in charge of protecting the atomic bombs, the atomic energy weapons, who left them open for terrorists to have access to for 4 years, who's now being promoted by Ronald Reagan. The nomination of Major General William Hoover to the job as Assistant Secretary of the Energy for the Defense Program has been stalled for a month by the Senate Armed Services Committee. This was in July, and I haven't read about his appointment yet. The attack on this gentleman was raised by Mr. Dingell from Michigan, John Dingell, Dingell, Democrat from Michigan, from the chairman of the House Energy Commission. He said General Hoover knowingly allowed nuclear test devices to remain essentially unsecure for 4 years at Los Alamos Laboratory, knowingly left them unprotected. 2, when General Hoover was called upon to make a crucial decision on whether to continue assembling nuclear test devices at Los Alamos, he failed to show that he was able to deal with a significant issue. 3, last year, Hoover did not give an accurate portrayal of the Energy Department's serious problems in an appearance before the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Later, he was forced to correct his statements that were less than candid. 4, he's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Military Application, Director of Military Application of the Department of Energy, and he referred questions that were, in quote, the general felt it would not be appropriate to comment before his own hearings. Now, they're holding him up, this appointment. He's to be promoted to a new job with authority over U.S. nuclear weapon production as an Air Force general. When he left the equipment and the atomic bombs vulnerable to being taken. Now, I believe that people inside our government have worked their way through Reinhard Gehlen, Otto Skorzeny, and Henry Kissinger, and Mr. Fritz Kramer and that gang to make us vulnerable to be overthrown someday. We don't know. I don't happen to think that any person, I don't know this General Hoover, of course, General William Hoover, but I don't think any person who knowingly leaves nuclear test devices unsecured or insecure for 4 years at Los Alamos should be given a promotion by President Ronald Reagan to have another job of responsibility. He was visited by Congressman Dingell last November, and they found that there were a lot of mistakes that he made, that he didn't want to testify before the committee. And why is it so necessary that Ronald Reagan promote this person at this time? If he gets this promotion or this job, he'll have authority over the United States production of nuclear weapons. And why should this man have the authority to have that just any more than these generals or admirals or people should come in and have the authority of dumping in the air or the oceans when there are no scientists to back up what they're doing? This team of appointments are crazy. They're out of hand. And I bring them up now. They're consistent with my earlier thesis about what happened with Barbie and Donovan and the various Nazis. What they did and how they moved into power is visible after World War II. But how they're undermining the United States is as visible to me as it is when you study France in 1930 to 1940 or Germany, and then when Hitler just came in and took those countries. These are weapons that should be secure, and any man like that who didn't secure them should go to jail for a few years, shouldn't be in charge of, with the authority over the production of more nuclear weapons. Well, the time is up now. I've got to run along before this tape runs out. We'll do some more horrendous appointments by Ronald Reagan and update some of the news again next week. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week.